The assault on Varath 9 began at dawn on the first day, and by the third day, everything had gone wrong. Vorath had led the main Draxari column through the central valley, just as he had planned. The first 48 hours had gone well. They pushed through the outer Sithrek defenses, destroyed 2 drone staging areas, and advanced nearly 30 kilometers toward the capital. The Draxari warriors fought with the precision and fury they were known for. Vorath allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This was what his people were built for. Then the Sithrek counteroffensive hit. It came from 3 directions at once, a massive wave of drone soldiers backed by mobile artillery platforms that the coalition scouts had somehow missed. The ground shook with the impact of plasma shells. The sky turned orange and black. The Draxari column was caught in a narrow stretch of the valley with high rock walls on either side, and nowhere to go, but forward or back. Vorath ordered his warriors to hold position and dig in. They fought for hours. The Draxari were tough, tougher than almost anything else in the galaxy, but the shelling was relentless. Warriors began to fall. Communications with the flanking Pelori units went dead. For the first time in many campaigns, Vorath felt the cold weight of uncertainty settle into his chest. A distress signal came through on the emergency channel. It was from Outpost Kenna, a small coalition position on the eastern ridge that guarded the approach to the valley. The outpost had been overrun. The Pelori unit assigned to reinforce it had pulled back under heavy fire. Without that ridge, the Sithrek could bring artillery down directly on the valley and destroy the entire Draxari column. Vorath cursed. He had no units to send. Every warrior he had was already engaged. He began to draft the order to abandon the outpost and prepare for a fighting withdrawal from the valley. It would cost them days of progress and hundreds of lives, but there was no other choice. Then a voice came through the comm channel. It was calm, steady, and completely unhurried. Commander Vorath, this is Captain Cole. My unit moved to the eastern ridge approximately 2 hours ago. We are currently engaging Sithrek forces at Outpost Kenna, requesting fire support coordinates if you have anything available. Vorath stared at the comm panel. The humans had moved to the ridge on their own, without orders, without authorization. They had left their safe reserve position and walked into one of the most dangerous sectors on the battlefield. His first reaction was anger. This was a breach of protocol. Units did not move without orders, especially not units assigned to the reserve. He opened his mouth to reprimand the human captain, but something stopped him. It was the sound of weapons fire in the background of the transmission, heavy and continuous, and underneath it, the sound of human voices calling out to each other with a practiced ease that Vorath recognized. These were not panicking soldiers. These were soldiers who were working. He patched into their helmet camera feeds. What he saw made him stop moving. The ridge was a mess. The outpost had been half destroyed by Sithrek shelling, and the ground was covered in rubble and smoke. In the middle of it, 12 humans were fighting with everything they had. Katie Lane was crouched behind a collapsed wall, firing her rifle in short, controlled bursts. There was blood running down her left arm from a wound just below the shoulder. She had torn a strip from her sleeve and tied it tight around the cut. It was not a proper bandage, but her hands were steady and her shots were accurate, and she showed no sign of slowing down. Nate Bishop was in the open. He had a wounded Pelori soldier over one shoulder, dragging the alien toward a covered position behind a pile of broken concrete. The Pelori was twice his weight, but Nate moved with a grim determination, his boots slipping in the mud as he hauled the limp body to safety. In his free hand he held his sidearm, and he was firing it back toward the enemy without looking, laying down suppressive fire by sound alone. Sam Harper was at the north end of the outpost. A section of the defensive barricade had been blown apart, and Sithrek drones were trying to push through the gap. Sam had put his shoulder against a heavy metal plate, and was physically holding it in place while calling fire support coordinates into his headset. His voice never wavered. His boots dug trenches in the dirt as the drones pushed from the other side. He moved between positions with a strange, unhurried walk that seemed out of place on a battlefield. He checked on each of his soldiers, adjusted firing positions, redistributed ammunition, and gave orders in a voice so calm it could have been giving directions to a restaurant. There was a dark stain spreading across the right side of his uniform, but he never touched it, never acknowledged it, and never slowed down. Vorath watched for hours. He could not stop watching. The humans held the ridge. They held it through wave after wave of Sithrek drones. They held it through a second artillery barrage that collapsed another section of the outpost. They held it when their ammunition ran low, and they began using captured Sithrek weapons that were not designed for human hands. They held it for 11 straight hours. When coalition reinforcements finally reached the ridge the next morning, they found the humans still at their posts. 3 of the 12 were dead. Every single survivor was wounded in some way. Katie Lane had taken a second hit to her leg, but was still firing from a sitting position. Nate Bishop had burns across both arms from a plasma round that had detonated near him. Sam Harper had 2 broken fingers on his left hand, and had taped them to his rifle stock so he could keep shooting. Danny Cole was sitting against a wall when the medics arrived. He looked up at them and said, "We have wounded Pellery in the back section. See to them first." The medics argued. Danny's wound was serious. The shrapnel in his side had been there for over 4 hours, and needed to come out. Danny repeated himself, more firmly this time, but without raising his voice. The Pellery first, then his people, then him. Vorath arrived at the ridge with the reinforcement column. He walked through the outpost in silence, stepping over Sithrek drone bodies and spent shell casings. He stopped at the edge of the ridge and looked out over the valley. The position had held. His entire column was safe because 12 humans had decided, without being asked, to walk into a fight that was not theirs. He found Danny Cole being treated by a medic. The human captain was grimacing as the shrapnel was removed. But he was making small talk with the medic, asking about her day, as if they were standing in a kitchen and not on a battlefield, soaked in blood. Vorath said nothing. He stood and watched. He noticed that none of the humans were crying or screaming. They made small sounds of pain, sharp breaths, and clenched teeth, but they also laughed with each other. Katie Lane said something to Nate Bishop that made him snort, even as a medic stitched his arm. Sam Harper was eating a ration bar with his unbroken hand, and complaining that it tasted like wet cardboard. They were hurt. Some of them were hurt badly, but they were not broken. Vorath returned to his command post that night and sat down at his terminal. He pulled up Danny Cole's full service record and began to read it carefully. It was a short file for a species that had not been in the coalition for long, but one entry caught his eye and held it. Charon 4, duration of engagement, 14 months. Unit strength at deployment, 400. Unit strength at extraction, 93. Vorath stared at those numbers for a very long time. Then he pulled up the general file on the Charon 4 campaign. It was marked with 3 separate classification warnings and a note that read, "Content may be distressing to species with empathic sensitivity." He opened it and began to read. He did not sleep that night. A temporary ceasefire fell over Verath 9, 3 days after the ridge. The Sithrek had pulled back to regroup, and the coalition used the pause to bring forward supplies and tend to their wounded. The air was still thick with the smell of burnt metal and scorched earth, but for the first time in nearly a week, the guns were quiet. Vorath found Danny Cole at the edge of the camp, sitting on an empty supply crate with his rifle laid across his knees. He was cleaning the weapon with slow, careful movements, the way someone might wash dishes or fold laundry. There was nothing urgent in his hands. He was just a man doing a small, familiar task, because it gave his fingers something to do, while his mind was somewhere else. Vorath walked up to him and stood there for a moment. Danny looked up unsurprised, as if he had been expecting this visit. "Captain Cole," Vorath said, "I have read the file on Charon 4. He looked at Vorath for a long moment, then set the cleaning cloth down on his knee and nodded slowly. "The file does not say much," Vorath continued. "Numbers, dates, unit designations. It tells me what happened, but it does not tell me what it was like." He paused. The next words did not come easily to him. Draxari did not ask for things, but he said them anyway. "I would like to hear it from you." Danny was quiet for a long time. The camp sounds drifted around them. Somewhere behind them a generator hummed. A bird, or whatever passed for a bird on Varath 9, called out from the tree line. Danny looked at the ground between his boots, and then he began to speak. "We landed on Charon 4 with 6,000 coalition soldiers," he said. "Draxari, Pelori, Vrelians, humans. It was supposed to be a quick liberation job, 3 weeks. The Sithrek had occupied the planet, and we were going to push them off. Command said it would be straightforward." He almost smiled at that word. Almost. "First week went fine. We took the northern plateau and set up a forward base. Then the Sithrek triggered orbital denial charges, big ones. They blew apart half their own satellite network to create a debris field so thick that nothing could get in or out. Our fleet tried to punch through and lost 2 ships. They pulled back to wait for reinforcements." He stopped cleaning the rifle entirely and held it still in his lap. "We waited too. 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. No word, no supplies, no evacuation. Just 6,000 soldiers on a hostile planet with whatever we had carried down with us." Vorath stood perfectly still. He did not interrupt. "The Pelori contingent broke first," Danny said. "Their commander took a sniper round on day 31. Without him, they could not hold together. They surrendered to the Sithrek in groups over the next 2 weeks. Most of them were put in holding camps. Some were not. The Vrelian units tried to negotiate safe passage off the planet. The Sithrek agreed to meet with their officers." Danny paused. "They executed them at the meeting site and broadcast it to the rest of us." Vorath felt something tighten in his chest. He recognized the tactic. The Sithrek used fear as a weapon as effectively as they used plasma rifles. After that, the coalition command structure fell apart. The ranking officers were dead or captured. Units were scattered. People were scared. That is when Major Caleb Price stepped up. Danny's voice changed slightly when he said the name. It did not crack or waver. It just became quieter, the way a voice does when it is carrying something very heavy. Caleb was from a small town in Oklahoma. Back on Earth, that is a flat, dry place in the middle of the country. He was not loud. He was not dramatic. He was just a man who looked at the situation and decided that someone had to hold things together, so it might as well be him. He gathered every surviving soldier he could find, human and alien, and organized them into a guerrilla resistance. Danny described the months that followed. They abandoned the forward base and moved into the hills. They dug tunnels by hand, using broken tools and sharpened rocks. They slept in shifts, 2 hours at a time, in holes barely wide enough to lie down in. They ate whatever they could find on the planet. Some of it made them sick. They ate it anyway. He told Vorath about Haley Voss. She was a combat medic, 26 years old, from a coastal town in Maine. When their medical supplies ran out, which happened within the first 2 months, she improvised. She performed surgeries using sharpened pieces of hull plating because their last scalpel had broken. She stitched wounds with wire stripped from communication cables. She operated by the dim glow of chemical flares, while Sithrek patrols moved in the darkness above their tunnels. She saved 47 lives with almost nothing. She never lost her calm. She talked to her patients throughout every procedure, telling them stories about the ocean back home, about the way the water looked in the early morning when the fog was still sitting on it. She said it helped them stay still. He told Vorath about Leo Grant. Leo was 19 years old. He had joined the military 8 months before the deployment, and Charon 4 was his first assignment. When their communications went down, someone needed to run new cable lines between the tunnel networks. The ground between the tunnels was mined. Leo volunteered. He made 7 successful trips across the minefield, sprinting through open ground with cable spools on his back, mapping the safe paths from memory. On his 8th trip, his memory was wrong by 2 steps. He was 19 years old. He told Vorath about Meg Dalton. Meg was a sergeant from Texas who had a loud laugh and a habit of calling everyone sweetheart, regardless of species. When the Scythrek discovered one of their tunnel entrances, Meg stayed behind to hold it, while the rest of the unit evacuated the wounded through the back passages. She held that entrance for 3 days. She slept in 10-minute intervals. She drank rainwater that dripped through the rock ceiling. She used the bodies of fallen Scythrek prones as a barricade, and kept firing until the evacuation was complete. When they came back for her, she was still alive, still at her post, and the first thing she said was, "Someone please tell me you brought something to eat." Then Danny told Vorath about the 100 days. The Scythrek command grew frustrated with the resistance, and decided to end it through sheer relentless force. They launched continuous ground assaults against every known human position. Not 1 assault per day. Not 2. Continuous, around the clock, for 100 days. The defenders had no choice but to match them. They fought in shifts. A soldier would hold the line until they physically could not stand, then crawl to the back of the tunnel, sleep for an hour, maybe less, and then go back. They did this every day for over 3 months. 41 humans died during the 100 days. Not 1 position was lost. Vorath's body had gone completely still. His scales, which normally shifted and moved with his breathing, were locked in place. His hands hung at his sides like stone. Among the Draxari, this was not a choice. It was an involuntary physical response, something that happened in the deepest part of their biology when they encountered something that triggered not fear, not surprise, but a profound and overwhelming recognition of something worthy. Danny noticed. He did not comment on it. He said that after 14 months, the Coalition fleet returned with reinforcements and broke through the orbital debris field. Extraction shuttles came down. By that time, there were 93 humans left from the original 400. They had sheltered and protected over 300 alien soldiers who had joined them in the tunnels. Caleb Price was not among the survivors. In the final week, when the fleet was already in orbit and the shuttles were on their way down, the Scythrek launched one last desperate assault on the main tunnel network. Someone needed to hold the rear entrance to buy time for the evacuation. Caleb did not ask for volunteers. He picked up his weapon and walked to the entrance himself. He held it for 2 hours. The shuttles landed, loaded, and lifted off. The last shuttle pilot radioed Caleb and told him to fall back. There was no response. Danny said all of this without raising his voice. He did not cry. He did not clench his fists. He spoke, the way a man speaks when he has told a story so many times inside his own head that the words have worn smooth like river stones. There was no drama in his voice. There was no self-pity. There was just the plain and terrible truth of what had happened, spoken aloud in the fading light of an alien world. That is what Charon 4 was, Danny said. He picked up the cleaning cloth and went back to his rifle. Now you know. Vorath stood there for a long time. He did not move. He did not speak. When he finally walked away, his steps were slower than they had been when he arrived. as if something new and unfamiliar had settled onto his shoulders. Something he did not yet have a word for, even in a language built for war. Vorath could not sleep. He lay in his quarters aboard the Iron Mark, with the lights dimmed and his eyes closed. But every time the silence settled around him, the words came back. 93 out of 400. 14 months. 100 days without pause. A 19-year-old boy running across a minefield with cable on his back. A woman performing surgery with a piece of metal in the dark. A man walking to a tunnel entrance, knowing he would not walk back. Vorath had fought in 40 campaigns. He had seen terrible things, and done terrible things, and carried the scars from all of them without flinching. But something about the way Danny Cole had spoken, that flat, quiet voice, with no pride and no bitterness in it, had reached a place inside Vorath that no weapon ever had. He gave up on sleep, and sat at his terminal. He pulled up the Coalition's xenobiological archives and typed a single word into the search field. Humans. The file that opened was enormous. Vorath had expected a short entry. Humans were a young species and a minor partner in the Coalition. But the file ran to thousands of pages. He began to read. He started with their biology. Humans were classified as endurance predators. This meant that on their homeworld, long before they built cities or flew ships, they hunted by chasing their prey across open ground, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days, until the animal they were chasing collapsed from exhaustion. Most predator species in the galaxy relied on speed, strength, or ambush tactics. Humans simply refused to stop moving. They sweated to cool themselves, a function that most species found disgusting, but which allowed them to run in heat that would kill nearly anything else. They could walk and run for distances that the archive described as extreme outliers among known sapient species. He read further. Human bodies could function under conditions that should have shut them down. They could continue to operate with broken bones. They could survive blood loss that would kill a pylori twice over. They had a chemical system in their brains that suppressed pain during moments of extreme danger, flooding their bodies with substances called adrenaline and endorphins. These chemicals did not heal them. They simply allowed humans to ignore the fact that they were dying long enough to finish whatever they had decided to do. The archive noted, almost as an afterthought, that this pain suppression system sometimes activated not only in response to personal danger, but in response to seeing others in danger, particularly others the human cared about. He thought about Danny Cole commanding for 4 hours with shrapnel in his side. He thought about Nate Bishop dragging a pylori soldier through gunfire. He thought about the way the humans on the ridge had checked on the wounded aliens before accepting treatment for themselves. It was not just toughness. It was something else, something the biology alone could not explain. He moved to the historical archives. What he found there kept him reading until the lights in his quarters automatically brightened for the morning cycle. Humans had been waging war against each other for their entire recorded history. Not occasional war, not periodic territorial disputes like most species experienced. Constant, uninterrupted, overlapping wars that stretched back thousands of years. The archive listed them in a scrolling index that seemed to go on forever. Wars over land, wars over religion, wars over ideas, wars that began for reasons that made sense, and wars that began for reasons that made no sense at all. He read about a conflict they called their First World War. Millions of humans had fought in trenches dug into the mud of their own planet. They lived in those trenches for 4 years. They breathed poison gas. They charged into walls of machine gun fire. They watched their friends die beside them. And then they got up the next morning and did it again. The archive estimated that over 16 million humans died in this single war. He read about a battle called Stalingrad. Two massive armies had fought over a single city in the depths of a brutal winter. The fighting was so close that soldiers on opposite sides sometimes occupied different floors of the same building. They fought with rifles, then with knives, then with their hands. The battle lasted over 5 months. The city was reduced to rubble. The humans kept fighting in the rubble. Nearly 2 million were killed or wounded. Neither side would stop. He read about human guerrilla wars, small groups of fighters who resisted vastly superior forces for years, sometimes decades, in jungles, mountains, deserts, and frozen plains. He read about resistance movements in occupied territories, where ordinary humans, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, took up arms against professional armies and fought not because they could win, but because they refused to accept what was happening. The more he read, the more a picture formed in his mind. It was not a comfortable picture. The Draxari were warriors by nature. Their entire civilization was built around martial excellence. They were born strong, raised to fight, trained from childhood to endure. War was the core of who they were. It defined them. They did not choose it any more than they chose the color of their scales. Humans were different. Humans were a species that wrote music. They painted pictures. They built hospitals and schools and libraries. They told stories to their children at night and made food for each other when someone was sad. They fell in love with each other and wrote letters and planted gardens and spent their days trying to understand the universe they lived in. They were builders, dreamers, healers, and thinkers. And when something threatened the things they loved, they became something else entirely. They did not transform into warriors because it was their nature. They transformed because they chose to. They picked up weapons not because they were designed to kill, but because something mattered enough to them that they were willing to become killers in its defense. And once they made that choice, they did not stop. They did not slow down. They fought with a ferocity and an endurance that came not from biology or training, but from something inside them that the archive could only describe as will. Vorath found a section on human psychology in combat. There was a concept humans called morale, which roughly translated to the collective emotional state of a fighting unit. Among most species, morale was tied to tactical conditions. If the situation was good, morale was high. If the situation was bad, morale dropped. This was logical. Humans did not follow this logic. Human morale was tied primarily to each other. A human soldier would continue to fight in hopeless conditions, wounded, starving, outnumbered, not because they believed they could win, but because the person next to them was still fighting. The archive called this unit cohesion, and noted that in humans, it reached levels that were, in the archive's exact words, irrational by conventional metrics. A human would die for the soldier beside them, not as a grand sacrifice, not as a calculated tactical decision, simply because leaving them was not something they could do. Vorath thought about Caleb Price, walking to that tunnel entrance in the last week of Charon 4. The shuttles were coming. He could have waited. He could have drawn lots. He could have ordered someone else. Instead, he picked up his weapon and went, because 300 alien soldiers needed time, and he had time to give. Vorath closed the archive and sat in the silence of his quarters. The ship hummed around him. Somewhere below, a green planet waited for the war to resume. He thought about something he had read in the human philosophy section of the archive. A human thinker had once written that courage was not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else was more important than fear. Another had written that a human was most dangerous, not when they were winning, but when they had been pushed to the point where they had nothing left to lose. Vorath understood war. He had been born into it and had lived his entire life inside it. But sitting in his quarters that morning, he realized that he had never truly understood what it meant to choose war, to be a creature of peace and softness and beauty who looked at the darkness and said, "No, I will not allow this," and then turn themselves into something that could fight the darkness on its own terms. His body had gone rigid again. He noticed it this time, but did not try to stop it. The Draxari had a word for what he was feeling. It was an old word, used rarely, and it did not translate well into any other language. The closest meaning was something like the recognition that you are standing in the presence of something greater than yourself. Vorath had used that word once in his life, when he was a young warrior standing before the monument to the Draxari founders. He used it now, sitting alone in his quarters, thinking about a species that had no claws, no armor, no venom, and no special healing. A species that should have been nothing in the grand scale of the galaxy. The Scythrek came at dawn. They came with everything they had left. The ceasefire had given them time to regroup, and they had used every hour of it. Thousands of drone soldiers poured out of the Scythrek staging grounds in a wave that darkened the horizon. Behind them came heavy armor, walking siege platforms that shook the ground with every step. Artillery lit up the sky in streaks of white and orange. The roar of it was so loud that it swallowed every other sound on the battlefield. The coalition defensive line was stretched across the outskirts of the capital city. Every unit was committed. There was no reserve. There was no fallback position. If this line broke, Vareth 9 was lost. Vorath stood at his command post and watched the reports come in. The western sector was holding under heavy pressure. The central line was bending but intact. The northern units were taking casualties but maintaining discipline. It was the eastern sector that worried him. It was the weakest point in the line, a stretch of broken ground between two bombed-out buildings where the Sithrak could funnel their drones through a narrow gap. If they broke through there, they could roll up the entire line from the side. The eastern sector was held by the human contingent. Vorath watched the tactical display and waited for the call he expected. The humans would see the size of the force coming at them, and they would request permission to fall back to a more defensible position. It was the smart thing to do. Any commander would make that call. The comm crackled. Danny Cole's voice came through, calm and steady. The same voice Vorath had heard on the ridge. The same voice he had heard telling the story of Charon 4. There was no fear in it. There was no urgency. There was only the plain, quiet sound of a man stating facts. Commander Vorath, this is Cole. Sithrek forces have breached the eastern perimeter. Estimated strength is 300 to 400 drones with armored support. My unit is engaging. We will hold this position. He did not ask for reinforcements. He knew there were none. Vorath stood very still for a moment. Around him, his officers waited for orders. The logical move was to let the humans do what they could and prepare a secondary line behind them. It was what any experienced commander would do. Vorath was not thinking like a commander. He was thinking like a warrior who had spent 3 sleepless nights reading about a species that ran down its prey on foot, that fought in trenches for years, that held tunnels with broken weapons and empty stomachs for 14 months, and never once asked for permission to quit. He turned to his personal guard. These were 12 Draxari warriors, each one hand-selected, each one carrying scars from a dozen campaigns. They were the finest fighters on the ship. With me, Vorath said. His officers protested. The command post needed him. If he fell, the entire operation could collapse. Vorath ignored them. He picked up his weapon and walked out the door. His guard followed without hesitation. That was what they did. They reached the eastern sector in 12 minutes, running at full Draxari speed through the shattered streets of the capital. What Vorath found when he arrived would stay with him for the rest of his life. The humans were fighting. That was not the remarkable part. Every soldier on this planet was fighting. The remarkable part was how they were fighting. Katie Lane had taken a plasma burn across her back. The wound was ugly, a wide streak of blistered and blackened skin that ran from her left shoulder blade to her lower spine. She was still at her forward position, still directing fire, still calling out target positions to the soldiers around her. She moved stiffly, and every time she turned her body, there was a tightness around her eyes that spoke of serious pain. But her voice never wavered, and her aim never faltered. Nate Bishop had turned a destroyed vehicle into a firing platform. He lay flat on its roof with his rifle, and was methodically picking off Sith-Wreck drones as they came through the gap. Each shot was precise. Each movement was deliberate. He fired, adjusted, fired again, with the patience of a man who understood that every drone he dropped was one fewer threat to the people behind him. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, and there was blood drying on his temple from a cut he had not bothered to touch. Sam Harper was at the center of the line, coordinating the remaining members of the squad with the same quiet professionalism Vorath had seen on the ridge. He moved from position to position, checking ammunition counts, adjusting firing lanes, pulling wounded soldiers back to cover. His left hand was wrapped in a field bandage that was already soaked through. But he used it anyway, gripping and lifting and pointing, as if the pain was simply one more piece of information his brain had filed away and decided to deal with later. And Danny Cole was standing in the middle of all of it, exposed, unhurried, and completely in control. Vorath walked up to him. Danny looked at the Draxari commander, and then at the 12 elite warriors behind him. Something passed across his face. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. "Where do you want us?" Vorath asked. It was the first time he had ever said those words to anyone who was not Draxari. Danny looked at him for a moment, and in that moment, something shifted between them that both of them felt, but neither would ever be able to put into words. Then Danny pointed to the left side of the gap, where the Sith-Wreck pressure was heaviest. "Hold that flank, and give Katie room to breathe." Vorath nodded once, and moved his warriors into position. They fought. They fought for 6 hours. The Sith-Wreck threw wave after wave through the gap. Drones piled over the bodies of other drones. The armored platforms advanced and were destroyed, and more came behind them. The ground became slippery with hydraulic fluid from shattered machines. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of plasma discharge. Humans and Draxari bled in the same dirt. A young Draxari warrior, barely out of his training cycle, took a heavy hit to his leg while shielding a human soldier from a flanking drone. He fell hard and cried out, a sound that cut through the noise of the battle. Before any Draxari could reach him, Danny Cole was there. He knelt beside the young warrior and pressed a field bandage against the wound with steady hands. He talked to the alien as he worked, his voice low and calm, telling him to breathe, telling him the wound looked worse than it was, telling him he was going to be fine. Vorath watched from 10 meters away. He saw the blood soaking through the left side of Danny's own uniform. Fresh blood. A new wound, or the old one opened again. Danny had not mentioned it. Danny never mentioned it. The young Draxari warrior looked up at the human pressing a bandage to his leg with hands that should have been shaking, but were not. And Vorath saw something in the young soldier's eyes that he recognized. It was the same thing Vorath had felt in his quarters 3 nights ago. The recognition. The Sith-Wreck broke at dusk. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way a wave breaks against a wall, slowly at first, then all at once. The drone waves thinned, the armored platforms pulled back, and then there was silence, sudden and enormous, filling the ruined streets like water filling a hole. Varath 9 held. In the aftermath, the Coalition Assembly gathered in the briefing room of the Iron Mark. Officers from 12 species sat around the same curved table where the campaign had begun. Vorath stood at the head of the table, as he had at the start, but he was not the same being who had stood there before. He was expected to give a standard victory report, a summary of the campaign, casualties, objectives achieved, recommendations for the next deployment. He had given such reports dozens of times. Instead, he did something that no Draxari commander had done in recorded history. He formally requested that the human contingent be recognized as equals in the Draxari warrior tradition. This was a status that carried the weight of centuries. It had never been extended to any species outside the Draxari homeworld. Several Draxari officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. A few looked openly shocked. Vorath spoke plainly. He did not raise his voice, and he did not make a speech. He simply said what he believed to be true. The Draxari have always held ourselves to be the greatest warriors in this galaxy. I have believed this my entire life. I no longer believe it is true. He paused. The room was perfectly silent. The humans do not fight because they are strong. They fight because they refuse to stop. They do not endure because their bodies are built for punishment. They endure because something inside them will not let them quit. I have watched them bleed, break, and burn, and I have watched them stand back up and keep fighting. Not for glory, not for conquest, but for the person standing next to them. He looked at Danny Cole, who sat at the far end of the table with his squad. Danny's face was still and quiet. Any species that can endure what they endured on Charon 4, Vorath said, that can hold a line for 14 months on nothing but willpower and loyalty, that can bleed beside strangers and call them family, has earned something that no title or rank can properly hold. But I will offer what I have. He turned to face Danny directly. Then he performed the Draxari salute of equals. He placed one closed fist against the center of his chest, bowed his head, and held his body rigid. It was the highest gesture of respect his people knew. It meant, I see you as I see myself. You are not beneath me. We stand on the same ground. The room was silent for a long time. Danny Cole stood. He straightened his uniform, which was still stained and torn from the battle. He lifted his right hand to his brow and held it there in the human salute. His eyes met Vorath's. The honor is ours, Commander, he said. Months later, long after Varath 9 had been secured, and the Sith wreck had been pushed out of the sector, a young Draxari cadet approached Vorath during a training exercise. The cadet was eager and curious, and still carried the unscratched scales of someone who had never seen real combat. Commander, the cadet asked, what makes the humans so dangerous? They are small, they are soft, they have nothing we do not have more of. Vorath looked at the cadet for a long time. His expression was unreadable. Most species in this galaxy fight until the pain becomes too much, he said. Then they stop. The humans feel all the same pain. They simply decide that stopping is not something they are willing to do. He paused. If you ever find yourself on a battlefield beside a human, be grateful. They will die before they let you fall. The cadet nodded, looking pleased with the answer. But Vorath was not finished. And if you ever find yourself on a battlefield against them, he said, his voice dropping low, then pray to whatever gods you carry, because they will not stop coming until either you are finished or they are. He turned away, then looked back one final time. And even then, he said, do not be certain. The warship Ironmark hung in the darkness above a pale green world called Varath 9. It was the largest ship in the Galactic Defense Coalition fleet, and its briefing room was filled with officers from 12 different species. Some were tall and thin, with skin like polished stone. Others were short and covered in thick fur. A few had too many eyes. One had no eyes at all. They all sat around a long curved table and waited for the briefing to begin. At the head of the table sat Commander Vorath Keln. Vorath was a Draxari, and even among his own kind he was considered large. He stood nearly 8 feet tall when he rose to his full height, and his body was covered in dark green scales that had been carved with dozens of ritual scars. Each scar marked a battle he had survived. He had fought in over 40 planetary campaigns across the galaxy. He had bled on frozen worlds and burning deserts. He had broken enemy lines with his bare hands and walked through artillery fire that would have killed most living things. The Draxari were the finest warriors the galaxy had ever produced, and Vorath was the finest among them. He believed this not out of arrogance, but because no one had ever given him a reason to believe otherwise. The briefing concerned the planet below. Vareth 9 had been taken by the Sithrek Dominion 6 months ago. The Sithrek were a cold and efficient enemy. They used massive numbers of drone soldiers backed by heavy siege weapons. Taking the planet back would require a full ground assault, and Vorath had been given command of the operation. He stood and began to outline the plan. His voice was deep and carried easily through the room. The Draxari would lead the main assault through the Central Valley. The Pelori, a species known for their sharp senses and defensive tactics, would hold the flanks. A dozen smaller contingents would fill support roles. It was a clean plan. Vorath had used versions of it many times before, and it had always worked. He was halfway through the tactical breakdown when the door opened and a small group of soldiers walked in. There were 4 of them. They wore simple gray uniforms with a blue patch on the shoulder that showed a small planet, Earth. They were humans. The one in front was a man of average height with short brown hair and a face that looked like it had been tired for a very long time. He carried himself quietly, without any of the stiffness or posturing that Vorath saw in most junior officers. He nodded politely to the room and said, "Sorry we are late, Commander. Our shuttle had a docking issue." This was Captain Danny Cole. Behind him came Lieutenant Katie Lane, a woman with red hair pulled back tight and calm gray eyes that moved across the room once and seemed to take in everything. Next to her was Sergeant Nate Bishop, a broad man with a square jaw and hands that looked like they had been used for hard work long before they had ever held a weapon. Last was Corporal Sam Harper, the youngest of the group, barely into his 20s, with a quiet face and a way of standing that suggested he was always ready to move. They took their seats at the far end of the table without complaint. Vorath watched them for a moment. He had read the briefing files on the human contingent before the meeting. Humans were a young species, only recently admitted to the coalition. Their homeworld was classified as a Category 12 death world, which was the second highest danger rating in the Galactic Registry. Vorath assumed this was some kind of clerical error. He had seen the humans. They had no natural armor, no claws, no venom glands, no ability to regenerate lost limbs. They were small, soft, and breakable. Every species in the coalition had at least one natural advantage in combat. The humans, as far as Vorath could tell, had none. He continued the briefing. When he reached the part about unit placement, he assigned the humans to the reserve line, far behind the front. It was the safest position on the map. It was where you put units that you did not expect to fight. Danny Cole listened and nodded. He did not argue. He did not ask for a better position. He simply wrote down the coordinates on a small pad and said, "Understood, Commander." Vorath took this as confirmation of what he already believed. The humans knew their limits. They were being smart about it. He respected that, in a distant kind of way, the same way he might respect a small animal that knew to stay out of the path of something larger. The briefing ended, and the officers began to file out. Vorath gathered his notes and was about to leave when a soft voice stopped him. "Commander, a moment." It was Althen, a Pelori intelligence officer. She was slender and pale, with large dark eyes that made her look perpetually worried. She spoke quietly, so that only Vorath could hear. "The human contingent," she said. "Did you review where they transferred from?" "I saw the file," Vorath said. "They came from a campaign on a world called Charon 4. "Did you read the details of that campaign?" "I did not see a need. They are standing and walking. The campaign is over. What is there to read? Althen hesitated. Among the Pellery, hesitation was a sign that someone was choosing their words very carefully. The coalition lost nearly 6,000 soldiers on Charon IV, she said. The campaign lasted 14 months. Most of that time, the ground forces were cut off from orbit, with no resupply and no evacuation. The human contingent was 400 when they landed. She paused. 93 came back. Vorath looked at her. He processed the numbers. They were bad, certainly, but the galaxy was full of bad numbers. Every war had them. They survived, he said. That speaks well of them. But survival is not the same as capability. I have seen many species endure terrible things and still crumble when the next fight comes. Althen said nothing more. She simply dipped her head and walked away. Vorath thought nothing more of it. He had a planet to take, and he did not have time to worry about a small group of soft aliens with a sad story in their past. Later that night, Danny Cole stood at a viewport on the lower observation deck. The green curve of Verath 9 filled the window, glowing faintly against the black. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, and his face still and unreadable. Nate Bishop walked up beside him and leaned against the railing. He looked at the planet for a while, then at Danny. Think any of them know? Nate asked. About Charon? Danny did not look away from the window. His reflection stared back at him, transparent and ghostly against the stars. No, he said quietly. Nobody out here ever does. Nate nodded slowly. He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. They had both been on Charon 4. They both knew what that meant. And they both knew that no briefing file, no matter how detailed, could ever put into words what they had lived through on that world. They stood there in silence and watched the planet turn below them. Two men carrying something heavy and invisible that the rest of the ship could not see. Somewhere above them, Vorath Keln was already asleep, dreaming of the battle to come, with the confidence of someone who believed he had already seen the worst the galaxy could offer.